Summary. So in the selective tests, you have, for the students that are sitting here right now, you will be obviously sitting down for 4 exams. So the reading test, mathematical reading, thinking skills, and finally the writing exam. So many years ago, the weightings for the exams were different. Writing used to be 15%, thinking skills used to be 35%. So I believe this was 3 years ago. But as of now, it's obviously changed. 25% weighting for all of the exams, pretty much equal across the board. And what that now means is that English is worth 50% of your final selective test mark. So it's obviously, it determines half of it, right? So it's obviously extremely important. And what's important to keep in mind is with the new computer-based formats, computers are provided at the test center, so not on your own device. Writing will be typed with a keyboard. So at this point where writing will be typed on a keyboard, it's extremely important, and I will provide some of my own personal recommendations and tips that I do provide NL English Academy students. And I'll share a few of those things with you today on why this is such a key differentiator. So obviously having writing with a keyboard, but also paper can be provided for working out. That's some important information to know. On the actual exam day, you get to choose from obviously 3 exam slots, and the testing will be held over the course of 3 days. Students only need to sit one of those days and complete all exams on one of those 3 days. And I think it's very, very important to note that I know there's been some discussions recently and with parent sentiment about, some parent questions that I've received in the past were actually, which exam day should I pick, for example? And I think to preface that, the best exam day that would fit is the one that works best for your schedule. I think that's the best answer that I can always give for that, because the Department of Education will always seek to make either of these exams, each exam day, the difficulty as equal as possible. So that's just a bit of the exam. So before we jump into the actual exam technique. So of course, if you have any questions as we go, feel free to note them down, and we'll have a Q&A at the very end. So again, reading and writing, it's 50% total weighting. And I think before I actually jump into both writing and reading exam strategies, one very important thing that I would like to share to students before I jump into it is exam technique is not as simple as just applying a formula to the whole entire exam. For writing, for example, as most of you might already know, that there's different writing exam styles that can be asked. So depending on the actual writing task that's given, there's a different approach, different macrostructure, different microstructure. For reading exams, depending on the actual reading question type, a completely different exam technique strategy should be used. And I'll jump into that into more detail when I get to that. But I think that's a very, very important thing just to preface everybody with before we jump into it. So let's first jump into the 25% weighted writing exam. So obviously it's an open response, 30 minutes for this exam. And any sort of question could be asked. So whether that can be creative, persuasive, discussion, or informative. And under these 4 umbrellas, under creative, it could be imaginative, personal recount. Creative, it can be a narrative or personal journal or any of these. No matter for all 4 of these text types, there's subgroups of writing questions, but in an overall sense, does come back to one of these four macro structures. So I think, to give an example, with informative writing macro structure, what falls under informative, you can consider newspaper report, you can consider a research article or an article or a formal recount, for example. I think there's pretty much endless possibilities of what can be asked, but before I jump into things, it's very important to remember that out of everything that can be asked, if you have, in an overall sense, creative writing, macrostructure, microstructure, stylistic techniques, if you have these concepts covered quite well, so creative, persuasive, discussion, and informative, having these four, and if you've prepared quite well for these four, then no matter what the question can ask, you have, obviously skills in your toolbox that you can pick from these four to approach whichever question you get. So it is an open response. To jump in with a bit of exam technique, I think before I actually jump into the exam technique, I want to speak about the rubric, so the marking rubric. Some of you may already know that the writing exam, it's marked in a two-tier rubric system. So you have set A, which is worth 15 marks, and then you have set B, which is worth 10 marks. So set A is essentially the style, form, and the content. So essentially what you're writing about. Set B, which is 10 marks out of the whole 25 marks, is more so on the specific details. So whether it's the sentence microstructures, or if you've used accurate grammar, punctuations used effectively, syntax is all perfect, spelling as well. So set A and set B of the marking criteria, it's differentiated from essentially what you're writing about in set A, and set B is how accurately and how polished you're writing it. I think that's the best way to frame it. But all up, it is worth, out of 25 marks. And obviously as a preface, keeping that in mind, obviously set A is 15 out of the 25 marks. The most important thing that at NL English Academy, we always stress to the students, and we push this quite strongly, is that when it comes to any writing style or any writing question, the very, very first thing that students must make sure of is to ensure that the purpose of your piece directly addresses the question requirements. So you're probably thinking that, of course, whatever the question is, I have to address whatever's on the paper, whatever the question's asking of me, right? But under time pressure, I've seen it many, many times across many students, where students, when they, say for example, if they haven't planned, they would think before the exam, okay, of course I have to do what the question is asking me. But I think many students here, for any students that are sitting here, you can probably relate to this when I say, how many times have you written a persuasive argument, for example, and then it's diverted off a tangent away from what the question is actually asking? I think many of us, if not all of us, including myself when I was a lot younger, we've all experienced this before. So the very first thing is to ensure the purpose of your piece directly addresses the question requirements, because if it diverts away, let's think back about how does that relate to the actual marking criteria. So I mentioned set A of the writing marking criteria, 15 out of the 20 marks, is directed on the style, form, and content. If the content of your writing steers away from what's asked of you in the question, then you can lose marks in set A. So that's the very, very first important thing to mention. So how do we actually address that? Right? How do we actually ensure that we remain on track throughout the whole piece? Planning is extremely important. what we suggest to students at an Academy is in 3 minutes, you want to plan out the direction and structure of your piece. So if it's a creative, you want to plan out your complication and work backwards for where you're starting and find the resolution. If it's a persuasive, 3 minutes, jot down 3 main points and why they obviously link to the question that's being asked of you. And even just a simple plan goes a long way, because think of a plan as, I'd like to share, and maybe let me think of an analogy for this, for any of the students, for you to understand this clearer. Think of a plan like a map. In the car, maybe if your parents are driving in the car and you're using Apple or Google Maps, imagine if you were to drive somewhere that you've never been before under time pressure. So you have to get there within a certain amount of time, and at the same time, you don't know how to get there. That's how it feels essentially in exam if you don't have a plan. Because what's the purpose of a map when driving? The purpose of a map when driving is to give you direction where you have to drive, where we're going, what's next, and how we're getting there, right? Same way for a plan. If we've structured it out on how our piece is going to look like in advance, then we know what's coming next. We know why we're writing what we're writing at the moment, and there's no confusion later down the line. And with even just 3 minutes of planning, one big sort of pitfall or hurdle that I've seen students run into in the past is that students that haven't planned, so the students who have planned versus the students who haven't planned. If you've planned, you're avoiding one big risk. And you might be asking, what is that risk? What I've seen many times in the past in students who haven't planned their writing before they jump into it, maybe because they're too eager to jump in, or students, they feel confident in being able to address the question. Regardless of how confident you are, a plan is very important, because even the best students who don't have a plan, what I've seen happen in the past, is that it might be 20 minutes of the exam has passed, or the practice exam has passed. There's 10 minutes left of the paper, and after obviously getting into that flow of writing or typing, getting that flow of typing, then suddenly stepping back and thinking, okay, does my piece make sense? And some students might read over quite briefly and realize to themselves that they've been addressing a completely different question, or they've been, it might be in creative writing where they've essentially diverted away from any sort of specific idea. So they might not even reach a complication because they've spent a long time possibly writing in circles about the same thing. I think even for the brightest students, for anything, if you don't have a plan and you don't directly address what is the purpose of your piece first and how that's going to answer the question, then you bring a lot of unnecessary risk that can arise later down the track in your, obviously in the time conditions. So I really strongly urge this for all the students that are watching. Planning is extremely important. Even 3 minutes, I know 30 minutes isn't much time, but 3 minutes, if you can plan in 3 minutes, just to get ideas, sort of get ideas that are floating, just skewer them in a line, and that's enough, I would say. Yeah, throughout the piece, I think it's also very important to have something that I call, so different teachers in our team will call it different things, but for me, I call it structured time checks. So essentially what that means is think about, after you've planned, you want to think about where you should be in certain points in time within this 30 minutes. For example, let's say let's just give a persuasive writing as an example. So let's say in a persuasive writing piece, you've got your introduction, 3 pure paragraphs, and a conclusion. And with this structure, let's compare that to the 30 minutes that you're obviously given. So introductions shouldn't take as long as body paragraphs, and conclusions should be pretty quick. But if you've spent 3 minutes on planning, then aim to get your body paragraphs, say, done maybe within 6 to 7 minutes. Your introduction, possibly four to 5 minutes or so. It's also always give and take, obviously, on where you're stronger at. But in your mind, the point that I'm trying to make is that for students that are watching this, in your mind, what I need you to do is to keep in your mind, okay, how long should I approximately spend for an introduction? How long should I approximately spend for each body paragraph? This isn't only relevant for, say, students preparing for selective, but also, say, HSC, right? HSC students preparing for their English HSC examinations for their essays. It's the same thing. It's very, very important to know in your mind where you should be at certain points in time. That's the reason for that is so that, say, on the clock, if there's about, say, 15 minutes left, so you're about halfway through the timing, you should be around halfway through your actual piece, or maybe if you've already started planning a bit, if you've gotten ahead or give and take in persuasive writing, give and take, you should have already started your second body paragraph, or maybe you might be near the start of your second body paragraph. So essentially, structured time checks it's something that students should use in order to keep in mind whether they're falling behind or ahead of the clock, because both cases can be detrimental. What I mean by that is if you're falling behind the clock, and say, for example, you've only got 5 minutes left, but you've only written an introduction. If you had structured time checks in place where you see the clock and you see where you should be, it's an indication for you to speed up or slow down. But I've also seen students where it would have been maybe 15 minutes has passed and they've finished their entire piece and they spend 15 minutes just looking back on their piece. That means the depth of their piece. To write a full piece in 15 minutes, that means that there can be more depth placed in that piece if there's so much time remaining. So we don't want to be, obviously sprinting ahead of the clock, but we don't want to equally be falling behind the clock. And having structured time checks, essentially, it keeps you accountable for that. One last thing is for students that are obviously students at the end of the piece, oftentimes you might have a minute or two left. It's very important that you actually check over your work purposefully. You probably see it on the page that I wrote on the slide. I said purposefully, not passively. And I'd like to elaborate a little bit on why I say that. So I've seen in many students, they might even have 3 minutes left, and in a past paper or in a mock exam, 3 minutes are left. And if what I've seen students do is they'd say that they're checking over their work, but all they're doing is essentially just reading it, like scanning through it, essentially as if it's for leisure, right? I think a mindset shift that I would like you to take away is when you're checking over your work, think about yourself in the shoes of a marker. And the most critical, the harshest marker that you can ever imagine, I want you to imagine yourself stepping into those shoes, then coming back and reading your work, as opposed to being obviously 2 minutes left, being proud that you finished your work and sort of reading through it passively and sort of slowly and seeing where things are. It's very important that in these 2 to 3 minutes, take these 2 to 3 minutes very, very seriously, as if you're a very serious, very harsh, very critical marker. The reason why I say that is because if you just switch essentially the mindset and perspective that you're thinking about your own piece in, what that does is it increases the chances of you picking out maybe a spelling error or a punctuation error or a grammar error or syntax error. I've seen it in the past, and at English Academy with our end of term exams, one thing in our end of term exams that we've seen is that, say, students would finish maybe a few minutes early and they would check over their work for the writing exam that we give. But then they spend that time, going over their work. But then how come for some students some students, when they check over their work, they pick out everything and everything's fine. They fix up all their grammar and spelling issues. But some students, they check over their work and there's still grammar and spelling issues there, although they've mentioned that they've checked over it. The difference is how purposefully they do so. And I think it's such a low-hanging fruit, because in the set B criteria, you can lose marks for inaccurate spelling, punctuation, grammar, etc. And I think if you know, obviously, how to spell a word, if you know how to use grammar in the right context, for that example, then you're sort of cutting yourself short if you're not showing, if you're not showing that on the exam paper, right? So I think it's very important to keep this in mind. Just as a side tip, so this is what I wanted to mention earlier when we were going through the exam summary. One very important thing to keep in mind is obviously that the exams are computer-based. So typing skills will be a key differentiator for your child's exam technique. And you're probably wondering why. But think about it like this. If students, let's compare two students with exact same ability. Just imagine if they were, let's say, a clone of a student, and they're the exact same ability, exact same everything, doing an exam under time conditions on the keyboard. If one student is very technically acute with typing, obviously on a computer, on a keyboard, and the other student, the clone, isn't, then I think it's pretty safe to assume that, if I ask the question, which student will complete the exam earlier, which student will spend less time trying to fix up small grammar issues, I think the student who will find it much easier to go about the exam will be the one who's fluent with touch typing. And I know many of you may be thinking, obviously, many of you might be thinking that, and I've heard from parents in the past, a sort of general sentiment that it's a disadvantage. But I want you to think about it like this. Because it's new, I wouldn't approach this as if it's a disadvantage per se, because there is still time to sharpen up skills. So I would think of this as, in many ways, like an opportunity or an example that your child, or for the students that are here listening, you have currently the opportunity to essentially sharpen up your exam skills through touch typing, which is simply just a skill to practice. It's not really related to academics, but it's an opportunity to master that. And if you've mastered that, if you've mastered touch typing, then it will, in terms of exam technique, it will place you ahead. But it's obviously not the reason for, it's not about the approach, but it's actually when you're writing, say, 300, 400 words. If you can type 300, 400 words accurately, without any spelling errors, without needing to go back and fix it, and you're able to quickly type like this, without poking your finger on the keyboard. Let's think, okay, one, it's obviously going to be more accurate, right, if you've mastered touch typing. So if it's more accurate, what does that mean? Set B criteria assesses your spelling, the grammar, punctuation, and the small nitty-gritty details, right? If you've written more accurately, you're less susceptible to make errors and fall short and lose marks in set B, right? When it comes to these structured time checks, if your brain is working faster than how fast you can type, then that means your typing is in the way of your thinking, right? But if you can type as fast as you think, then completing the exam and say even completing one body paragraph will take you significantly less time. And to save time in the exam is a very, very significant differentiator. So yeah, these are some of my thoughts on the writing exam. I know I went on a bit of a tangent on a few things, but of course, for the parents and students here, if you do have any questions, please do feel free to jot a message down on the chat at the very end, or keep this question in your mind, and we'll have a Q&A at the very end. So yeah, this is the writing exam, and obviously a few exam techniques and a bit of insight from me on the approach and how I would go about the writing exam. So let's move on now to the reading exam. So the reading exam, it will be slightly more, I guess, in depth with a few things, because I'd first like to run through the structure of the reading exam, and obviously the exam technique, as I mentioned earlier, the exam technique and time management strategy for different parts of the exam will obviously vary depending on what the actual section of the exam is. So the reading exam is 45 minutes, 38 marks total. Question 1 to 8, you have obviously your MCQs. Question 9 is word choice. It's a new section in the exam where, very similar to closed passages, there's gaps in the text, and essentially you're trying to find what's the best fitting word for that out of the 4 options to select from. Then after the word choice section, students will be completing poem MCQs, then either closed passage or summary statements, and obviously lastly at the end, the choose the extract section. So obviously in total it's worth 38 marks, and obviously we're all seeing now that there's different marks allocated to different sections, right? 10 marks for choose the extract, which is much more than all of the other question styles. But the main thing to keep in mind is, on a spectrum of exam technique, at NL English Academy, obviously at NL English Academy, we go through the different exam technique for each one, so students know exactly how to approach it for every single question. But to give you a bit of a summary, it's essentially on a spectrum between skimming/scanning and textual analysis. And what that means is some questions require students to use skimming and scanning skills, which is essentially going through a piece, picking up key ideas, keywords, anchors, etc., to develop meaning and provide context for the answer. Some other questions require students to sit down and think deeper to uncover an answer, essentially, like an onion, peeling back the layers. So depending on the actual question style, so depending on each of these 5 question styles, a different exam technique should be used depending on the different exam part. And what's also reflective of that, and what's also consistent with that, is obviously depending on the exam technique that you use for each of these 5 sections, a different time management strategy should be used as well. So as I noted here, some sections require more/less time and depth in analysis than others. So you can assume, say for example, the choose the extract section. Choose the extract section is more so skimming and scanning, and I'll go through that into more detail in the next following slides. However, compared to poems, because there is more inferencing needed and there's more digging beneath the surface required, then it does take more time per question. So it's not an even split. It's not an even allocation of time for each question. Some questions take less time, some questions take more time. But what's important is that you understand that idea, because the questions that take less time are meant to be framed and are created in that way to ensure that there's extra time essentially per question reallocated to questions that need more time, for example, the poem section. So that's something that's very, very important to keep in mind. And obviously for these, if you have any questions, please do note them down. We'll have a Q&A at the very end, but I will jump into a slide for each of these 5, and I'll walk you through exactly how NL English Academy students will obviously approach it for these question styles. So The first one being dual extract MCQ comprehension, which is obviously 8 out of 38 marks. Before I jump into the actual exam technique and how NL English Academy students will approach this, I'd like to go through obviously the testing platform. It's pretty intuitive. You can pick, if you can follow my mouse here, extract A, extract B, which you can toggle and switch between. If you need to flag a question, so essentially if you need to make an estimate and come back to it, you can flag it here to come back to later. And obviously toggling between the questions by going back and forward. And it's essentially split up in like a split screen style exam formatting, which is pretty intuitive. But to give a rundown, so for this section of the exam, you're given 2 extracts. And out of these 2 extracts, it seems like it'll be straightforward in the way where you have 2 extracts and you'll have to do a few comprehension MCQ questions for each of these, but that isn't always the case because it's not as straightforward as oftentimes getting one text. If in the case you have 2 texts, then some of the questions can be specifically on one text. Some of the questions can be about both texts at the same time, and what are the shared themes and ideas between the texts. Obviously, when you're reading through these 2 extracts, it's very important to know after you read one extract, and then when you read the next extract, in your mind, you should be thinking about what are the key overlaps that are between, say, extract A and extract B, right? What are the key overlaps in ideas? What are the key overlaps in themes? Possibly, for example, it can even be, what's the key overlap in character arc? If there's 2 different characters, but they go through a similar arc. They go through a similar arc in different contexts, for example. But yeah, the exam technique that NL English Academy students, that we obviously teach to the NL English Academy students, when we go through these extracts, it's very important to connect the keywords of the question stems by skimming. So when reading through these extracts, it's very important to essentially in your mind, you want to essentially anchor in your mind, okay, the flow of the text, any changes that happen in the text, and essentially drop down anchors throughout the text that you can come back to in your mind and do so for both of the extracts. I would recommend 2.5 minutes per text. That's just a brief ballpark, but it obviously does give and take depending on the text as well. But I would aim for that. When you are actually going through the question, I'd like to talk about an approach. So many students, what they would do, and this applies to all questions, so not only this section, but what students oftentimes, what they might do is when approaching a question, they would read the question and read through the answers and select one out of the 4 answers, which is, yes, it is, obviously the generic approach, which I'm sure many, if not most students approach it with. But what I would recommend students do is not only connect the keywords to the question stems, which are essentially the main idea of the question, or the main, say, for example, if this is a quote, connect that to where your anchor is in your mind in the text. But what I would recommend to students is do not look at the answers yet. It's very easy to immediately go to the answers and see, okay, which one best fits without actually formulating an answer in your head first, right? What can happen in that scenario is that it can lead to some biases in your mind where, say, biases in your mind in the way where out of these 4 answers, because you haven't formulated your own answer in your mind yet, then you're relying on these 4 to determine what your answer is. Which is obviously, that's what we're doing in the exam, right? But consider this. What I would like you to do is, after you read the actual question, I want you to decide in your mind, and you might have already seen this if you've been seeing, the NL English Academy free resources and what we've noted on them. But what's important is before you look at the answer options, only read the question, and I want you to formulate in your mind what you think is the answer without seeing the actual answer options. So think about what the answer is for that question, essentially in your own thoughts, in your own mind, before you look at the answers. So without the bias of looking at any of these 4 answers, just have the question, and in your mind, just think about, okay, what can this answer be? What do I think is the answer? And after you formulate your idea of what the answer should be, then you should go to the answer options. Excuse me. Then you should go to the answer options and select one of the 4 choices that best fits the answer that you already had in your mind. And I think it's very important to go through that process of elimination as well. So if there's an option that is very different to the answer that you had in your mind, then you can essentially eliminate it. And a few things that I'd like to know as well is here: stylistic features, structure, language, and comparative analysis. So throughout the extract A and extract B, look for stylistic features, especially, for example, any metaphors, because metaphors, it's essentially like a big glaring beacon in the text where if there's stylistic features, if there's motifs, extended metaphors used and symbolism used in the text, it's there for a purpose, right? It's there, obviously motifs and metaphors, it's there to symbolize something, right? And naturally, if it's there to symbolize something, there's deeper meaning beneath the surface. So I would strongly recommend you to keep that in mind when you're reading. Okay, so what are the stylistic features that are being used? Is there any symbolism that's being used, and why? The structure is also equally very important as well. So sometimes it's an excerpt, sometimes it might not be a whole short story, it might be just an excerpt, it might be just an opening. So think about the structure of the piece, because that can form, these are sort of dots, right? Dots that are in the mind. And if you keep these things in mind, you can eventually connect some of the dots depending on what the texts are. So an example of using structure or an example of identifying or being able to use structure to help with your analysis is if both of the pieces were both openings, then structurally you can find some comparatives between the two, right? Obviously in 2 different contexts, they're both openings, and openings to what? So it sort of opens up some questions in your mind, right? And the more questions that are in your mind and the more dots that you place in the mind, the easier it is to actually connect them when you approach the questions. So yeah, this is dual extract MCQ comprehension and a few things in terms of exam techniques. But in an overall sense, for this, it is a mix between skimming the questions in the text as well as analyzing, depending on the question. So think of dual extract MCQ comprehension as sort of in the middle between, say, choose the extract, which is more so scanning, and then poems on the outside of the spectrum, which is mainly going in on textual analysis. So yeah, that's for the first part of the reading exam. We'll jump to the next part. So it's essentially, it's not new anymore because we've had the recent Selective Test exam jump into it, but I think for many students it is still quite new. So word choice questions, as I briefed a little bit about earlier, you can sort of see here, it's one text, only a couple lines long, but in each of these gaps, you can see that when you click on these gaps, 4 potential answer options come up. So for students, what your task is here is to see and to identify which word best fits into the given gap. And it might seem easy, right? It might seem easy, but they can get difficult. And based on from NL English Academy students, I think a lot of the students have been able to tackle this quite well. But there are certain times where questions like this can get difficult. For example, if there are two words that have slightly nuanced meanings, or if they are simply words that are pretty complicated, right? So in terms of the exam technique for this question, I think it's very, very important first to scan the entire text first. So as opposed to going through and answering each one by one, it's best to go through every line, skim through it with the gaps in place, and have essentially like what I like to call like global context of what the text is actually talking about. And after you scan the whole text to understand context, which is essentially what's the tone that's being written here and what's the main idea, then your mind will already start piecing together what are words that should be here to continue the flow of idea or the flow of the text without you actually seeing these four answer options. So essentially, before you actually click into any of these options, if you've already skimmed and scanned through it, you should already be able to pick out and see, okay, what type of word, for example, noun, verb, or adjective, and which specific word in your mind would actually be best fitting for that gap. And in most cases, you will already have a word that will fit into there quite neatly, right? And it'll just be a matter of, okay, which out of the four is closest to the word that I already had in mind. That's essentially the idea. So obviously, after determining the flow of the text, which is the idea that before this gap and after this gap, the word that's in the middle there should have it flow cohesively. It should have it run pretty cohesively. So if you've already determined the flow of the text, then it'll be quite natural to find, okay, what's the word that connects the two trains together, right? Think of it like a train. When you've got different carriages, you have to connect the carriages together. That's essentially what the words, obviously the purpose of these words will be. And for each of these gaps, I would aim for under a minute for each gap, but for students, you can definitely do it in much less. And this section, it's one of those sections where you can save time in this section to allocate to other sections of the reading exam. And I guess essentially just a tip from me, if you are stuck between two phrases, read each of these four words out under your breath. So read the phrase out under your breath, right? For each of these words. Naturally, I think we can sort of hear ourselves talking when we're speaking in conversation, and it's a bit of a trick, right? That if you can read it out and it sort of feels right, instinctually makes sense, then it's probably the right word. And if you read out the other ones and something feels off, then it's probably not the right word. I think that's a pretty key tip to keep in mind as well. Yep, that's word choice questions, and it's obviously 8 out of the 38 marks for this small section. So moving on to part 3, poems. Poems are less in terms of the mark allocation, 6 marks. However, these 6 marks are they're essentially key differentiator marks because many students struggle with poem MCQs, right? And I think the main thing is the reason for that is because it requires students not to skim and scan anymore, but it's on the very other side of the spectrum where we need to essentially pick up our shovel and dig as deep as we can inside the text, right? So think of it as if you're like a gold miner. You have to keep digging and keep digging because the gold's at the very bottom. That's essentially what a poem is. many students would try to go through poems quickly by skimming through it and then find that the answer that they gave wasn't actually the correct answer, although they would have thought it was. It's because, first, poems are rarely ever literal in meaning. So what that means is what you're seeing in first, face value is rarely going to be what the actual purpose and what the main message of the poem actually is, right? And if you keep that in mind, then you can essentially assume that what you're reading on first glance is not the answer. What you're reading, what you're understanding about the text is not actually what it's about. It's like going back to the analogy of digging for gold. If we're in a gold mining field and the dirt looks all the same, right? But it's only until we dig down that we can see if there's actually gold underneath, underneath the surface or not. So that's something that I think is very important for students to keep in mind. And for the NL English Academy students, obviously there are textual analysis strategies to dissect metaphors and obviously uncover symbolism. So we have a lot of approaches and strategies in that way on how to pick apart poems and find where to actually dig, how to actually dig to look for the gold. But to give a bit of a summary, which I think is important for all students to understand, that whenever you see metaphors being used or in poems, recurring ideas being used, these are all like blaring alarms and beacons that are essentially calling out to you, saying for you to analyze where that is. If a lot of metaphors are being used, and the same metaphor is being used, then there's something there, right? There's gold underneath that. And when you uncover what that metaphor actually represents, then that's when you find the gold. And you're probably wondering, what is gold when it comes to poems? It's this: any implicit meanings or links to society/human experiences. So what that means is, I'll give you an example. I think it might be clearer for the students here if I give you an example. So let's say I've read many poems where water has been a central recurring theme. It's been a recurring motif, and it's been a metaphor that's been plopped throughout each stanza. If students just read the poem on face value, they might think it's just a poem about a river, right? Water flowing. But that's never usually the case. And in the past poems that I've read, say water could represent passing of time, for example, which is a human experience. It could be the coming of age and growing up, right? Obviously, as water trickles from one side of the creek to another, the poem is no longer just about water and the river per se. We're able to dig it and pick it apart and realize that the poet is actually trying to say, for example, that time passes, right? And is writing a poem about that. Or it might be an idea about nostalgia. It might be an idea about family. It might be, about love. All of these more important society/human experience related ideas are what, a lot of these metaphors tend to represent. So that's something to keep in mind. Depending on the text length, and obviously depending on the other sections of the exam give and take, I would aim to analyze the poem in 3 minutes. It can sometimes take longer when you're purely just analyzing the poem and uncovering the symbolism. But it's quite important, even if, say, the poem has a less number of words, it might seem shorter than the first short story MCQ section. It's very important to still take the time and effort to analyze the poem in depth, because without that depth and care in the textual analysis, what can happen is that you overlook where the gold is. You overlook these metaphors and whatnot. Students often rush this section because the poem is often shorter than other texts and takes less time to read. However, do not skim this section. If you skim this section, it's very, very easy to, it's very, very easy to obviously miss the keyword, the key idea of what the poem is actually saying. So yeah, that's the poem MCQ comprehension section. I know if you have any hands up or anything like that, please do feel free to note the question down so that obviously at the end we're going to have just an open Q&A just via the chat, and I'll answer any questions that you might have. And if you have any questions, please hold on to them and we'll address them at the very end. So yeah, poem MCQs in a nutshell. So again, most students find this part the most difficult section. Jumping into the fourth part. So this part, closed passages or summary statements. So in the selective exam, you can get one, either or, either closed passages or summary statements. And essentially, this section of the exam it's testing the same way of thinking or approach. So I would consider them a similar thing. But the main thing is that closed passages, if you see and look closely, there's little gaps. Similar to the word choice questions, there's little gaps throughout the text. And what you're essentially trying to do is finding, which of these phrases best fits into any of these gaps. So it's putting this one into this gap, or this one here, finding which one fits into which gap. And whereas for summary statements, there'll be paragraphs, and for each paragraph you'll be picking which of these sentences best summarizes that paragraph. And from face value, they might seem like two very different questions, but when we step back and understand the intent of what these questions, what this section is trying to assess, it's essentially trying to assess how well can we understand the flow of the text. Very similar to word choice questions, the flow of ideas, how ideas connect. So within a paragraph, how ideas from the topic sentence throughout the different parts of the paragraph flow together. And students are essentially, the task is to understand what that flow of idea is, what the flow of the text is. And if you can understand the flow of the ideas in the text and just understand how the sentences in each of the body paragraphs flow, then you'll be able to tackle either of these questions or both of these questions, because they essentially assess the same thinking process. To give some context, there are six essentially answers that you give. So 6 parts where you drag any of the options into. However, you're giving seven possible answers. So there is one dummy answer, right? There is one dummy answer that you don't need to use. The main thing is, so many students, obviously, say for example, when students before they, and I've seen this many times in the holiday programs actually at NL English Academy, where students might not have learnt exam technique for closed passages and summary statements in the past. And we might be learning closed passages and summary statements, exam technique, but before students have actually learnt this with us, they might have approached closed passages in a way where they just do the first answer options first. They just do gap A first, and then gap B, and then gap C, D, or they just do it from top down, just in order. But it's very important to note that for this question, because there's dependency between each of the answer options. So for example, for this option, if this one was supposed to go into gap E, but you put it into gap A, not only will you get the gap A, the gap A mark incorrect, you will also get the gap E mark incorrect as well. Because you're essentially using the answer of another gap and using it in the incorrect gap, which makes essentially two gaps incorrect, if that makes sense. So do not start from top down. Students must start from the easiest gap first. So where that typically is at certain points in time is introductions and conclusions are oftentimes the easiest to start with because they're more so quite summative. And this text type, for this section, these texts are always informative. So if we know that it's informative, then we know that most likely it's going to have a summative introduction and a summative conclusion. Some of them don't actually have conclusions because there's a maximum number of paragraphs to be given, say for the summary statements, because you're summarizing each paragraph. But it's quite important to note that, okay, if it has an introduction, that's probably where to start. Or if you say there's a gap that's at the end or the start, these are also easier to tackle first as well. Because obviously the first sentence is usually like a topic sentence. The last sentence is like a linking sentence to summarize the main idea of that paragraph. So if you read through the main idea of this paragraph and you find that there's a gap at the start, then you can easily sort of pick out that, okay, which sentence is introducing whichever point I just read, essentially. So start with the introductions and then gaps that are at the front and at the back of paragraphs. And essentially when you do that, you're essentially narrowing down your options, because if you start with the easier ones first, there's high likelihood you get them correct, but then you're also limiting the pool of answers that you can select from. So that when it does come to the more difficult questions, there's only maybe 2 or 3 answer options to select from for the more difficult questions, which actually makes the difficult questions slightly easier as well. So these are a few suggestions, a few recommendations for exam technique for the closed passage and summary statement sections. And again, time-wise, aim to skim the text 3 minutes or so. I think this is also quite a give and take, but on the spectrum between analyzing and skimming, it's more so on the skimming side, because obviously with informatives, there's not as much, or there rarely is, say, symbolism, metaphors, motifs that you have to dissect and analyze. It's more so understanding, okay, what's the key idea of this informative? What's the main idea of each body paragraph? And that can be skimmed, right? You can skim through and anchor in your mind what these key ideas are. And that's the approach that I would recommend for students. Moving on to, obviously, if you have any questions on this, note it down and we'll do a Q&A at the very end. Jumping to part 5. So part 5 is interesting. It's the choose the extract section. And as you can see, you've got 4 extracts. Each extract is quite short, as you can see on the left. And obviously, out of all of the sections of the reading exam, you've got 10 marks, right? This section's pretty big. It's 10 marks. But you can see that each extract, it is quite short, right? And essentially, this question style, for students, what it's assessing of students is it's seeing how well students can draw and understand nuanced differences between similar texts. And I say similar because I'll describe what the difference between each extract is. Because each extract, it's not just 4 random extracts. For this question style, there's always a shared theme. What that means is there might be a shared theme of, let's go back to the example of water that I use for poems. So say there might be a shared theme of water, right? Extract A might be on like a short creative excerpt on a sailor in the seas. Extract B might be an informative extract about the water cycle. Extract C might be maybe another informative about how water is filtered, how city water is filtered, for example. Extract D might also then be a short creative excerpt on a mermaid in the water as well. So with this example in mind, it's quite evident that out of these 4 extracts, they're all tied to the same theme, but they can be not only one, a different structure or a different text type, whether it's creative or informative, but they're going to be slightly different in approach as well. How these texts are approaching, how they're expressing the idea about the given thing, for in this case, water, right? So I think the main thing is reading retention strategies. It's very, very important. So at another English Academy, there are certain reading retention strategies that we teach to our students when it comes to say these sections on how to actually read through a text and anchor your thoughts and keep these things in mind, and when you should do that. Essentially to optimize your time to information retention ratio. You want to spend the least amount of time. The goal is to spend the least amount of time, but retain the most amount of information, right? That's quite important, especially for this section because it's 10 marks and there's significantly more marks allocated to this section than any other section in your reading exam. To give a bit of like a general overview on how, right? How do we actually retain? Skimming for keywords and anchors. That's exceptional. It's significant. And the way you skim for these words, it's not only like trying to find, words from each sentence, because that will take time. I think the main thing is in each extract, there will always be clues and hints on 1, if it's creative or if it's informative, and 2, what the main idea actually is. So usually it's like there will be one sentence that would essentially represent the entire extract, right, or cover the main idea. So for students, once you skim through this, in your mind, you should formulate essentially like a summary in your mind, okay? After reading extract A is about pirate in the seas. So you can, in your mind, just anchor pirate in the seas, extract A. Extract B can be, if it was about precipitation, condensation, okay, water cycle. Extract B, water cycle. Students, you'll need to anchor these summaries for each extract in your mind. It makes it easier to come back to and to keep in mind when you're doing these choose the extract questions, because these choose the extract questions essentially are, it's like rapid fire, right? It's like rapid fire because for this section, I say 30 seconds per extract and 30 seconds per question, because you can skim the text in 30 sections. You can skim the text in 30 seconds and anchor that main idea in your mind. But then similarly, when you go through each question, for example, which extract describes a feeling of awareness of being in a dream, then usually students should approach this sort of like a rapid fire. You'll immediately know which one it is, depending on which one you anchored in your mind. But in the case you do need to look back, allow for around 30 seconds per question. The reason why there's less time allocated per question for this is because it's more so on the skimming and scanning. So it's essentially the epitome of skimming and scanning just for the main idea, right? Whereas for poems, it's all textual analysis. And textual analysis takes a lot more time. So it's not about saving time. It's about reallocating time, right? 30 seconds per extract and 30 seconds per question for the choose the extract section should be reallocated to, say, the poem section. So to think from like a more macro sense, how things should fit when it comes to the whole exam in its entirety. So personally for me, and I think for many other students as well, personally for me, I prefer to actually start the reading exam with this section, because I think given that it's at the very end, it's sort of like quick fire. I prefer to start with this section and know that it's quick fire, so that I sort of have an idea of how much time on the clock I can accurately spend on, say, poems, for example, when it's a lot more difficult. It helps with the planning, and for me personally, I prefer it to accumulate time first and then reallocate it when I'm doing the exam off the fly. So that's pretty important to just keep in mind. For obviously, these are the 5 reading exam sections for the reading exam. But just as a bit of like an overall tip that I want to reiterate again and again and again, and it's the same thing we obviously strive to push for with NL English Academy students. Obviously at NL English Academy, because when we cover each question type, we have the specific exam technique that's required. I think it's very important to always consistently keep that in mind. And I would assume the same thing is the case for maths and thinking skills as well. I would assume it's the case where there's different maths types of questions, different thinking skills types of questions, and a different approach should be used depending on what the actual question type is. So I think that's extremely important. So jumping to the next, I think before we jump into the Q&A, I wanted to just sort of talk a bit more about, obviously we have this masterclass today, but obviously our free resources. So for students to practice a few of these exam techniques, we do have a lot of, say, even if you see here, question sets for short story MCQ, for poems, closed passages, vocabulary lists where you can practice for word choice questions, book recommendations, a couple of checklists as well for creative and different writing styles, and I think just a few free resources. So these obviously there's no sign up or anything required. It's just there on our website. So if you search up NL English Academy free resource bank or just resource bank, it's just there. I would recommend students, you can download these and practice. And obviously, if you've noted a few things down from today's masterclass, I think it's very important to note and keep these things in mind when you approach these practice questions. Because some personal tips from me, building exam habits, they are exam habits. So habits aren't easily changed over time. So it takes consistency and dedication to unlearning previous old habits and relearning the right habits that will set you up for essentially success for the selective test.